Brian Jean is back. The former leader of the Wild Rose Party won a by-election in Fort McMurray-Lac-La-Biche with a close one. Actually, it wasn't that close at all. 64% of the vote. He received congratulations on social media from Alberta Premier Jason Kenney. But how happy is Kenney really, considering that Jean says the UCP needs a leadership change? To talk about this in more detail is Tyler Dawson, the Alberta correspondent with the National Post and our legislative reporter. Tyler, some political pundits are saying if Jean makes waves right away, he may be punted from caucus and will have to sit as an independent.
It's definitely a possibility. You know, the UCP has been a pretty broad tent and pretty tolerant of dissent so far. But there is a line, of course. You know, Leela Ahir lost a cabinet post over calling for Kenney to resign. There are two people sitting as independents at the moment, Todd Loewen and Drew Barnes, who were booted from caucus for being too critical of Jason Kenney. And Brian Jean has not pulled very many punches over the past 6 months or so. He's called for Kenney to resign. He wants to be the Premier of Alberta. So he's going to be a huge thorn in the side of Jason Kenney if he stays in caucus. The question is whether or not he's going to stay in caucus and for how long, because, of course, in a month's time, we have this leadership review of Kenney coming up. The other factor that's at play here a little bit is at a certain point, an independent caucus in the legislature becomes its own caucus, which means that it will get its own research budget and things like that. And that's when you can really start having these sort of independent MLAs cause problems because they just have more resources. So that's very much something that the United Conservative leadership, you know, the Premier's office, they want to avoid that. They don't want this, you know, independent group of troublemakers basically to have, you know, resources and get that many questions and you know, the opportunities in committee, all these sorts of things that can cause them trouble. So there's going to be a lot of wrangling, I think, to watch in the next month or two on where exactly Brian Jean fits into this system. Who knows? Maybe after the leadership review, they'll all decide to play nice and focus on winning the election next year. I think that is actually another possible option.
Well, let's talk about that leadership review in Red Deer, April the 9th. How many fireworks do you think we'll see? I mean, Premier Kenney has his supporters, but so does Brian Jean.
Yeah, and you know, there does seem to have been some sort of background work being done across the province, trying to organize people to come, trying to perhaps offer some money for people to come, because of course there is a fee associated with attending the special general meeting. I don't actually know what to expect, if I'm being perfectly honest, because it is sort of a mini convention. You know, there's like a dinner on the Friday night for some of the constituency association presidents. The voting is on Saturday, and at some point late Saturday, we should know the outcome of that. You know, it's not going to be sort of 2 weeks down the line that we find this out. So, but it's in Red Deer, which is obviously very, very central for the people of Edmonton and Calgary, but you know, if you're coming from Grand Prairie or Lac-La-Biche or even Lethbridge, you know, it's a little bit of a hike for these people. So how many people are going to show up is a big question. And you know, the other strange thing, maybe not strange but remarkable, is Premier Jason Kenney has said he's looking for 50+1 of the vote. You know, 51%. He's got the confidence of the United Conservative Party, which is true, I suppose. But you know, historically speaking, leaders have often looked for higher numbers than that, you know, mid-60s, mid-70s as sort of the benchmark they're trying to reach. So even if he wins that, you know, just how tight is his hold on the party is going to be something else to watch. Long-winded way of me saying, I don't know if I expect too many fireworks per se, but I do think there'll be a lot of stuff going on in the shadows in the next month or so. And then even if Jason Kenney wins that day, the trouble's not over. And if he loses, obviously they're going into a leadership race. So lots of sort of possible paths the future of this thing can go, I think.
And what's interesting as well, Tyler, a recent poll by Think HQ said 61% of Albertans want a new premier, but as we know, only party members get a chance to vote in the leadership review.
Yeah, and that polling actually also showed that something like 59%, I think, of people who voted United Conservative last time also think there needs to be a new leader. So, you know, hard to say, I guess, whether or not people who voted UCP last time translate into party members. But, you know, people could be signing up, getting a party membership if they feel that strongly. And, you know, it's early days, too, I should note, in this sort of economic boom sort of thing we seem to be in at the moment, you know, and I had a source tell me at the last convention that, you know, $100 barrel of oil plasters over a lot of problems for Jason Kenney. And I think that's true. It could be true in the next year when we go to the polls, but is that going to be enough by April 9th? That's a little bit harder to say, I think.
Premier Kenney was in Lethbridge recently and had a chance to chat with him, and I asked him specifically, will we be receiving any like Ralph Klein when we had those dividend checks, $300 for every man, woman, and child. Now that, there's a balanced book, so to speak, right now, we're back in the black. And he says, as long as we can completely pay down the debt, which is in about 2 years, then you'll see some Kenny cash, as he put it. So I thought that was interesting. Now let's circle back to the by-election in Fort McMurray for a second here, Tyler. It was a bit of a surprise that the leader of the Alberta Wild Rose Independence Party, Paul Hinman, only got, 628 votes? That was less than the NDP candidate, Ariana Mancini, received over 1,000. Do you think Hinman will maybe step down as leader?
I don't know if he'll stand down as leader. It's a little bit of a question, I think, in some of these small parties, how much the party is the leader, and whether or not the party sort of has the infrastructure to come up with someone new. But honestly, totally shocking, I thought. I didn't expect Paul Hinman to win. In spite of all the noise we hear about independence parties, they don't tend to perform that well in elections. But in the heart of oil country, to have the new Democrat candidate, not that the New Democrats in Alberta aren't fairly supportive of oil and gas, but it's just a strange scenario where you'd have the NDP candidate doing better than Paul Hinman, who's been around for a long time as a sort of a known name in Alberta politics as a former Wild Roser back, when the Wild Rose Party was not the Wild Rose Independence Party, I should say. But it does sort of go to show a little bit, how much legs some of this stuff has. He's been really, really vocal about some of the COVID restrictions and bringing those down, equalization, all of these other issues. And, people talk about independence, they make a splash, the media covers independent stuff whenever it comes up. But when you look at on the ground, when the votes are counted, they're just not that effective. And so I think that was very interesting. And you're right, it will be interesting to see what happens with that party in the year ahead going into the next election.
I think about some of the federal parties too, the independent parties, like the Maverick Party as well. And, the PPC is not really an independence party, but they didn't get any seats either. So you're right, it seems like people seem to go with more the main parties when it comes to elections, federally and provincially. Now, Tyler, the province announced as part of Budget 2022 that $72 million will go towards charter schools. Now, can you explain what kind of schools these are and what the funding will go towards?
Sure, and I had to look it up. I don't have children myself, so, a lot of this education stuff is just peripheral to me. So charter school, they are sort of quasi-public schools. They don't report to a public school board. They report directly to the province, and they tend to focus on specific things such as music or focus on science, things like that. Not quite the same as a private school, such as a religious private school or something like that, but not a fully public school either. And so this money is sort of to go to capital costs and operating costs. There apparently hasn't been sort of sustainable usual funding for charter schools, the government says. So that's what this money will sort of help establish. I think there's about 16 of them around the province, 15 or 16. Compared to obviously the much larger public school system. So the people that run the charter schools are obviously very, very happy about this, to have this funding, and the people in the public school system, are obviously saying that they'd prefer the money go to the public school system. So it's part of this sort of choice in education thing the United Conservatives have going for them, that they talk about, whether that's homeschooling or charter schools, just providing more options, I guess, to parents who are concerned about the public school system or would prefer their children be educated somewhere else. So, just part of this larger spending of money that money we suddenly have.
It appears as though the UCP made a rash of budget-related spending announcements, and among them, Tyler, an increase from $2 to $5 million to improve security for religious groups such as churches and charities at risk of violence or hate crimes. Tell me more about that.
So this is funding basically that was announced last summer. The $2 million was announced last summer, and yeah, it's for security or surveillance cameras, things of that nature, to protect institutions at risk of hate crimes or vandalism, things like that. Of course, we saw a rash of arsons at churches last summer or late spring, I guess maybe. So it sort of came out in the wake of that sort of stuff. But because of good money in the budget, lots of revenue, that's gone up to $5 million. So that fund will have even more money in it available to the people who wish to access it. So as you mentioned, just part of this, every leader, every party does like a grand tour after a good budget to announce new funding. And that's just one of the ones that stuck out this week to me as a little bit notable.
Now, I don't know about you, but every time I go to the pump right now, it seems like I'm in shock. I'm stunned and I need therapy after filling up at the pumps right now. It's just incredible. The price of gas that we're paying, I think in Lethbridge right now, we're about $1.60. What are you at in Edmonton right now?
A little bit higher than that, about a buck 65. So not totally wild, but certainly the most expensive I've ever seen it.
Now, but fortunately, we will be receiving a break of about 13 cents a litre with the UCP holding back the provincial fuel tax. But there's a bit of a catch, and what is that?
Well, it's graded. So if oil is below $80 a barrel, there's no fuel tax break. If it goes above 80, it sort of it drops by X number of cents per dollar, I guess, of price on a barrel of oil. So of course, where oil is at right now, I think it was about 97 or 98 dollars on Wednesday. The fuel tax is going to drop. Now this is on gasoline and diesel. It's not on aviation fuel or something like that. If that's what you were hoping to stock up on, and it should. I guess you could look at it either way. It either saves Albertans about $1.3 billion a year, or it's going to cost the government about $1.3 billion a year. At any rate, that's the number that's in the budget for what the fuel tax is each year. So a little bit of relief. Of course, at the same time, the carbon tax is going up to 3 cents to about 11 cents a liter. So balances the scales a little bit there, maybe, at a time when oil and gas prices are, on one hand, very good for the government, and on the other hand, a little bit inconvenient for people at the gas pump. So we should see some relief there in the coming weeks ahead. Who knows what gas will look like at that point, though, and how much that 13 cents is going to help.
Yeah, that takes effect on April the 1st. Tyler, the NDP attempted to get a permanent ban on coal mining in the eastern slopes of the Rockies with a private member's bill introduced by Rachel Notley, but it was promptly shot down.
Yeah, so we've talked about this a couple times, I think. This goes back to this 1976 policy on banning basically coal mining on the eastern slopes. The UCP 2 years ago suddenly revoked this, and there were going to be exploration and projects going ahead. There was pretty significant backlash from small towns and mayors in southern Alberta. And the UCP sort of backtracked on that. They asked for a study, an independent study that was done. The results of that are back. The recommendation was essentially the 1976 policy go back into effect, which has happened. So that's the situation right now. The UCP is going to look at sort of further modifications to the rules around coal mining on the eastern slope. So there's a handful of projects that are still in like the early phases that are going to continue to be analyzed and sort of go ahead, but a lot of further stuff possibly being shut down. What the NDP wants is a legislative ban on coal mining on the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. They say basically that what Energy Minister Sonia Savage did in going back to the 1976 policy is basically a ministerial order. She could, in theory, revoke that at any time. So they want this to be legislated. The UCP, in order for this to have gone straight to second reading in the legislature, there needed to be unanimous consent on the bill. That did not happen. So now it goes back to sort of a committee that evaluates all private members' bills. It's a long-winded way of me saying there's this legislative wrangling on the coal policy. There's this, small town Alberta political wrangling on the coal policy. At the moment, we're back to where we were 2 years ago or so, with more to come on it, no doubt about that. And this is a thing that I think we're going to continue to hear a lot about in the months ahead, because it's such a big deal. For southern Alberta and small towns in southern Alberta, and also for environmentalists in the city. So it has these very interesting sort of bipartisan urban-rural alliances and stuff like that make it a very, very interesting topic in Alberta politics right now.
Tyler, we are going to have an exclusive one-on-one interview with Premier Jason Kenney March 23rd here on Bridge City News. But in the meantime, our Premier has his own radio show, which launched in Calgary and Edmonton.
Yeah, a bit of a strange one when the press release came out to all of us, and we're like, oh, what the heck is going on here? So it's a call-in show. So over the pandemic, the Premier had done these Facebook Lives quite often where he took questions from the public, addressed misinformation, things like that. And he's now gone to the radio for this. There is some precedent for this. Apparently, Ralph Klein had a call-in radio show at one point. Not that I remember it, but it did apparently happen. And so the first episode was on Saturday. The Premier's office does not have editorial control of this. It is the two radio networks hosting it, but takes calls from the public, I guess, and then they ask him questions. So, not earth-shattering news or massive political developments, but just kind of interesting, of course, in the context of the April 9th leadership review coming up, in the context of an election year coming up in the next 8 months. Well, I guess 8 months until the year arrives, about a year until it's election time. So just very interesting in the context of those things.
But, it's pretty cool. As an Albertan, you can sit back and you can dial in and talk to the Premier. So you have questions for him. That's pretty cool. Tyler, the UCP is poised to have another fight with healthcare workers. The Health Sciences Association of Alberta's workers have been without a contract since 2020 and haven't seen raises since, 2016?
Yeah, that's what the union says. So this is a group of healthcare workers that sort of pharmacists and speech language pathologists, pharmacy assistants, respiratory therapists, that sort of set of healthcare workers. And so they're basically asking for raises over the next 4 years, like of 2, 3, 4% raises over those years. And AHS countered with wage cuts was their sort of responding offer. So you can see this as like the early opening negotiation fight. But, they've asked for like, at the highest, I think about an 11% wage cut. They want a 5% wage cut for pharmacists, things like that, which no one's going to be happy about a wage cut of those sizes. So perhaps this is just the opening of negotiations and they'll come to something else. But, as we saw with nurses, as we saw with doctors, this is a big political issue beyond just sort of being a union employer issue. The NDP obviously is going to side with the union on this one. There's going to be a lot of noise made about it, supporting healthcare, public-private healthcare, all this stuff. And of course, again, in the context of an election coming up in a year, this sort of where they're fighting with healthcare heroes is very, very crucial to the NDP's attack on the United Conservatives right now. So it's going to be quite interesting to see where that contract goes, where the politics of that goes in the months ahead.
Yeah, we'll see how this plays out, definitely. The Alberta correspondent with the National Post and our legislative reporter, Tyler Dawson. Thanks for joining us today from Edmonton.
Always a pleasure, Hal.